Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou e te ihi, tēnā koutou e te wihi. Tēnā koutou e te wana, tēnā koutou e te mana. Tēnā koutou e te tapu, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning and welcome everyone, and thank you for making the time to come along and be with us today. My name's Denise Cosgrove. I'm the Chief Executive of Presbyterian Support Northern, and I'm really excited to host this inaugural lecture series on child wellbeing. So over the next 4 months, we're consciously enabling sessions like this where we've got intimate audiences bringing interested public, private and not-for-profit and other sectors together with our 10 keynote speakers on a range of very complex social policy issues connected with the issue around child wellbeing. We want to provoke discussion, debate and hopefully some collaborative action on some ways to actually impactfully shift the outcomes for our tamariki, for our children in New Zealand. This is a defining focus, as we know, for the new government and for our Prime Minister. It's an issue also that's really dear to the heart of Presbyterian Support Northern. So our key goal, our vision is a better life for everyone, and our key goal is about building capacity. So we do that for individuals and families through our suite of services, from Lifeline to Shine to Enliven and Family Works. But what we're also doing is we want to take a leadership role outside of government and help build the capacity of the community and the sector and the system. So this series is actually one way we're trying to do that, and we're providing access to leading-edge thinkers and commentators, novel practices and efficacious policy solutions. We know that the questions around child wellbeing are multifaceted and complex, and it needs cross-sectoral integrated approaches. So we really do support a national conversation. So today, we're excited that our first speaker is Dr. Andrew Leigh. He is the Federal Minister for Whena in the ACT, but he actually has a massive portfolio. So he's the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, he's the Shadow Minister for Competition and Productivity, Trade and Services, Charities and Not-for-Profits. But not only do you hold down a huge portfolio, Andrew, you're also a noted economist, academic, researcher and prolific writer and speaker. In fact, he's written 2 speeches for our lecture series, one for today and one for tomorrow. He's written and contributed to numerous books. I think all have very intriguing titles. I don't know if any of you have encountered them. But one's called The Prince's New Clothes. Why do Australians dislike their politicians? And another's called The Economics of Just About Everything. The hidden reasons for our curious choices and surprising successes. So they both sounded titles I'd quite like to find out more about. And Andrew has been very well noted and acknowledged. So he was the Economists Society of Australia's Young Economist of the Year in 2011. That's actually an award that's only given once every 2 years, and it's to honour the Australian economist under the age of 40, so it was in 2011 and we can speculate then on your age, who's deemed to have made a significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. And and in there you also raised 3 young sons, and you're about to compete in the Boston Marathon. So, you know, a high achiever. So Andrew's topic in Auckland today, as it says up there, is really interesting. Equalising the Antipodes. What can New Zealand and Australia learn from each other about reducing inequality? So the structure of our time this morning is that Andrew's going to speak and then I'm just going to facilitate a discussion. So we really invite you while Andrew's talking to think of some questions, and we want to have a discussion and debate, and then we'll close the session. So, Andrew, let me invite you to come forward and share with us your lecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. Well, thanks, Denise, for a really generous introduction there. And I've got to say, I love a lecture which starts with a safety briefing. So I'm glad we all know what to do in the event of adversity striking us. Can I, of course, acknowledge the Maori people, the traditional owners in the land in which we meet. Thank Presbyterian Support Northern for inviting me to deliver these lectures, and particularly Denise Cosgrove and John Dixon. And also to recognise so many of you working on the coalface of inequality, Tim Hazeldine, an inequality researcher who's here, and those of you who've gotten out of bed early to engage in the big conversation about egalitarianism. In Eleanor Caton's Booker Prize-winning novel The Luminaries, Crosby Wells is writing back to his brother in 1854, explaining why he plans never to return to England. Naturally, he starts with the weather in Dunedin. The sun is bright on the hills and on the water, and I can bear the briskness very well. But then he turns to social class. You see, in New Zealand, every man has left his former life behind, and every man is equal in his own way. Of course, the flockmasters in Otago are barons here, just as they were barons in the Scottish Highlands. But for men like me, there is a chance to rise. It is not uncommon for men to tip their hats to one another in the street, regardless of their station. The frontier here, I think, makes brothers of us all. Ironically, it was in England that I first became interested in New Zealand inequality. Working with the late Sir Tony Atkinson, we began to explore long-run taxation statistics to ask whether the historical trends in inequality in Australia and New Zealand matched the myths. Was it true, as one 19th century gold digger had written home to England, that rank and title have no charms in the Antipodes? Our series starts in the early 1920s, when the tax data is available in a sufficiently disaggregated form to allow comparison across countries. At that point, we found that the top 1/1000th of New Zealanders had incomes around 40 times the national average. In Australia, the share was similar. But in Britain, the top 1/1000th had incomes about 90 times higher than average. And then came the Great Convergence. With only a few fluctuations, the half-century from the 1920s to the 1970s saw a steady equalising of national incomes. In all three countries, Britain, Australia and New Zealand, the top income share fell dramatically. By the late 1970s, the top 1/1000th of New Zealanders had incomes only about 10 times larger than the national average. The Australian figure was almost precisely the same. The British figure only slightly higher. Max Rashbrook sums up some of the policies that underpinned this shift. New Zealand Labor's 1938 Social Security Act created a free healthcare system, introduced a universal family benefit, and extended age pensions. More public housing was built, alongside union achievements, such as the 8-hour day. As political scientist Leslie Lipson put it, when New York had its Statue of Liberty, New Zealand might well have created a Statue of Equality in Auckland or Wellington harbours. This egalitarian era, in which wages grew faster on the factory floor than the corner office, was marked by significant social improvements. As the decades went by, ordinary families were more likely to own a home, a car, a fridge, a washing machine. An annual holiday away from home became the norm, rather than a privilege reserved to the very rich. The prosperity of that post-war era was broadly shared across the community. It's been a different story in recent decades. Over the past generation, the incomes of the top 1/1000th have approximately tripled in New Zealand, as they have in other English-speaking countries. Other metrics also show a rise in inequality. Rapid deregulation of the economy, cuts to taxes and benefits, and a reduction in union power widened the gap between rich and poor. If you go to Baldwin Street in Dunedin, you can walk up the steepest street in the world. And similarly, a graph of inequality in New Zealand from the 1980s to the 1990s shows a rise as steep as we have seen anywhere in the advanced world. According to the Productivity Commission, the share of national income going to workers has dropped by 8 percentage points since the late 1970s. Last year's household income report, prepared by Brian Perry for the Ministry of Social Development, found that the poorest tenth of New Zealand households had real incomes after housing costs that are lower today than they were in the 1980s. Meanwhile, real incomes for the top tenth of households are 2/3 higher than they were in the 1980s, after their housing costs have been taken into account. And although much of the increase in inequality took place late last century, there's little evidence that things have shifted back since then. Housing is a critical component of inequality today. 1 in 10 New Zealand children live in households where there's a major problem with dampness or mould. 1 in 12 live in households where the family often puts up with feeling cold to keep costs down. And 1 in 25 children do not have their own bed. At the top, it's another story. Research by the University of Otago's Helen Roberts reveals that over the period 1997 to 2013, real CEO compensation at listed firms rose 114%, nearly 4 times faster than average worker pay, which rose just 26% in real terms. Now that parallels trends in Australia, where the average reported pay of ASX 100 CEOs rose 44% in real terms over this millennium, 3 times faster than average worker pay, which grew just 13% in real terms. Given that, it's little surprise that 2/3 of New Zealanders believe the government should reduce inequality. My collaborator in New Zealand inequality, Tony Atkinson, passed away on New Year's Day 2017. His last book, Inequality, What Can Be Done, moved on from describing the trends to discussing solutions. In the same spirit, my focus today will be on what we can do to reduce inequality in the Antipodes. And in particular, I want to talk about what our two countries can learn from one another about reducing the gap between rich and poor. So let's start with what New Zealand can teach Australia. First, the quality of the data is far higher in New Zealand. So the first step towards breaking an addiction is admitting you've got a problem. The first step towards addressing inequality must be setting out the scope of the challenge. The annual Household Incomes Report and its companion report using non-income measures is as good as exists anywhere in the world when it comes to analysing inequality. That's to the credit of its author, Brian Perry, but also the willingness to invest in surveys that measure the multiple dimensions of poverty. Those metrics include whether children have a waterproof coat, whether they can afford to eat fresh fruit and vegetables, whether they can afford to play sport. New Zealand has a history of investing in studies that track individuals over time, such as the 1972 Dunedin Longitudinal Study, the 1977 Christchurch Health and Development Study. More recently, Statistics New Zealand's integrated data infrastructure has linked up individuals' de-identified data with data from a range of government and non-government sources. As Carmel Sepuloni's incoming ministerial brief noted, this has provided insights about the relationship between social housing and incarceration, mental health and earnings, maternal services and childhood risk. Now, those relationships aren't necessarily causal, but they do point to areas that policymakers should explore. And by contrast, Australia's been much slower to join up our databases. Even at the same tier of government, there's often a reluctance to share data to build up a better picture of disadvantage. The example of New Zealand's integrated data infrastructure shows us what we might miss out on as a result. Second, I'm impressed by the government's focus on child poverty. Not only is Prime Minister Ardern the Minister for Child Poverty Reduction, but her government's proposed a child poverty reduction bill that will require the budget to report progress on reducing child poverty. This is proposed to be done using the same approach as the 1994 Fiscal Responsibility Act, now the Public Finance Act, which requires the government to set targets for net debt and publish its progress on meeting those benchmarks. As in the case of government debt, there won't be a penalty for failing to meet child poverty targets. But as we've found with the Australian Closing the Gap exercise, targets do focus government and public attention on the problem. And it's not as though the child poverty rate is noticeably different in our two countries. According to the OECD, the child poverty rate, measured as the share of children living in households with disposable incomes less than half the median, is 13% in Australia and 14% in New Zealand. Third, I'm deeply impressed on how much further New Zealand has travelled in your nation's recognition of its Aboriginal inhabitants. Last December, my wife and I travelled around New Zealand with our 3 sons. We loved it, of course. But one of the most moving experiences was to take the children to Te Papa in Wellington. And the boys were fascinated by the exhibition of the Treaty of Waitangi. And it naturally prompted the question from them, why didn't Australia have a treaty of this kind? It isn't for want of trying. Last June, over 250 Indigenous leaders met in Central Australia. And the result was the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which called for a First Nations voice in the Australian Constitution and a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement-making and truth-telling between governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In October, it was utterly rejected by the Australian government. As my colleague Senator Patrick Dodson observed, it was a real kick in the guts for the Referendum Council. There's a lot that Australians can learn from New Zealand's success in formalising the roles of Māori people in the nation. From the All Blacks haka to the dual naming of places and organisations, there's a naturalness to the way in which New Zealand honours and celebrates its First Peoples. Now, allow me to step onto thin ice as I risk playing the role of a foreigner telling you what to do. If I offend, I have only one defence. It's the reason that John and Denise brought me here. So, what might an egalitarian New Zealander learn from Australia? First, you might be able to do more to target social expenditures towards the poorest. Peter Whiteford, a professor at the Australian National University who formerly worked at the OECD, has calculated the ratio of cash transfers paid to the poorest fifth of the population and compared them to the cash transfers paid to the richest fifth of the population. There's some countries, among them Austria and France, where the poorest fifth actually get less in cash transfers than the richest fifth. In the typical advanced country, the amounts are about the same, meaning that cash transfers are neither progressive nor regressive. In New Zealand, they're mildly progressive. There's about 1.5 times more given to the poor in cash transfers than to the rich. But Australia spends 11 times as much in cash transfers on the poor as on the rich. Now, because Peter Whiteford's analysis is based on OECD data, there's an inevitable lag, so the precise numbers may be slightly out of date. But even if there's been some changes, it's unlikely today that cash transfers are more progressive in New Zealand than Australia. And it suggests that there may be ways in which New Zealand can learn from Australia about how to better target government resources to the neediest. Second, it may be worth New Zealand considering whether the balance of power in the workplace has shifted too far towards employers. This is particularly true when firms have substantial market power. In its 2017 Economic Survey of New Zealand, the OECD observed that what they politely called muted competition may be holding the economy back. Uncompetitive markets don't just mean higher prices for consumers. They can also mean that firms exercise a degree of monopsony power in the labour market. One area in which the pendulum may have swung too far is employment protection. A measure the OECD calculates for its 34-member countries is protection of permanent workers against individual and collective dismissals. New Zealand ranks as the country that provides least protection against dismissal, below even the United States, with its at-will employment contracts. Australia isn't much further up the list. Out of the 34 OECD nations, we're the one which is the 6th easiest for an employer to dismiss a worker. There is a significant difference between our two nations on this dimension. With the labour share of national income significantly lower today than it was a generation ago, providing better dismissal protection is likely to strengthen the power of workers to collectively bargain for higher pay and improved working conditions. Third is to recognise the role that foreign investment plays in sustaining employment. As you know, the Antipodes enjoyed among the highest wages in the world by the end of the 19th century. One reason for this was the high amount of land per person. While Europeans lived cheek by jowl, there was plenty of room to swing a sheep in Australia and New Zealand. In economic terms, one reason that wages were high in our countries at the end of the 19th century is that the capital to labour ratio was high. Now today, both Australia and New Zealand have strong immigration programs. We're taking in among the highest share of migrants in the advanced world. Migrants can fill skill gaps and start businesses. They can boost innovation and encourage exports. They're more likely to create patents and win Nobel Prizes. But migrants also have the inevitable effect of lowering the capital to labour ratio. To the extent that migrants are adding to the number of workers available to do a given job, this may place downward pressure on wages. And it was former Australian Treasury Secretary Ken Henry who pointed out to me that foreign investment has the opposite effect. By increasing the available capital, it pushes up the capital-labour ratio. So by accepting foreign investment alongside migrants, a country can keep its capital-to-labour ratio constant and therefore sustain good wages. Now there's many vexed issues surrounding foreign investment. National security screening, public attitudes, the amount of tax paid by foreign investors. But as the OECD noted last year, New Zealand's inward direct investment stocks are substantially lower than in a number of other small, high-income OECD countries. They recommend steadily removing screening requirements on sectors such as construction and retail trade, demonstrating tangible benefits to the general public. They also advocate a public register of foreign direct investment to provide better transparency, allowing the public to see who owns what. What the OECD fails to mention is that such an approach, if managed carefully, could conceivably also reduce earnings inequality. And finally, there's shared challenges that neither nation has dealt with particularly well. About a third of the rise in inequality is due to the decline in union membership. Since 1980, the unionisation rate has dropped from 69% to 18% in New Zealand, and from 50% to 16% in Australia. Put another way, it used to be the case that most workers were union members in our country. Now, 5 out of 6 workers are not in a union. Antipodean unionisation rates are still above the American unionisation rate, which currently sits at 11%. But on current trends, our countries could be at that level within a decade or two. A continued fall in union membership is likely to put upward pressure on inequality. In both nations, it's also the case that crime rates are falling for most offences, and yet the incarceration rate is rising. In our two countries, about 1 in 500 adults are today behind bars. This has a disproportionate impact on Indigenous Australians and Maori, since both groups are overrepresented in jail. Incarceration limits future labour market opportunities, since employers, particularly in service industries, are reluctant to hire ex-prisoners. Incarceration also impacts on children. More men in jails means fewer fathers in the home. And fiscally, rising incarceration imposes a substantial cost on the budget, with a night in a jail cell costing the taxpayer about as much as a 5-star hotel. Justice experts are increasingly realising that while a 20-year sentence costs twice as much as a 10-year sentence, it's very unlikely that it has twice the deterrent effect. Peter Gluckman, the New Zealand Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, recently noted the past half-century saw criminal justice costs grow twice as fast as any other category of government spending. Both Australia and New Zealand have more work to do in identifying policies that can reduce both crime and incarceration. And that means better understanding the relationship between the formal and informal labour market, basing crime policies on evidence rather than emotion, and improving the quality of rehabilitation programs, as I know PSN's working hard to do. Australia and New Zealand also share the dubious distinction of slipping backwards in international tests in science, reading and maths. Over the 15-year history of the OECD's PISA exam, New Zealand's average score for maths has dropped 42 points, more than any other country. Australia isn't far behind, with a 39-point fall. In Australia's case, this continues a longer trend. Since the 1960s, the literacy and numeracy of young teenagers has either flattened or worsened. John Hattie, who's worked in both countries, says that education policymakers have sat back on our laurels. Many experts point to the importance of teacher quality in reversing those trends. Yet neither country seems to yet to be doing enough to ensure that the teaching profession attracts and retains the very best. In a speech in Wellington 4 years ago, Labor leader Bill Shorten noted the commonality in how Australia and New Zealand approach the world. At our best, he observed, we've shown a neighbourliness and a courage, and a lack of prejudice, and a love of the outdoors and a life of the mind that has drawn to the region not just tourists attracted by our natural wonders, but all those who admire our civilisation, our society. At its best, a society working without panic, without snobbery, without cultural warfare, in a spirit of affable consensus and decent communal care. We believe in the fair go and a chance for all. When I ask my economist friends why they believe in reducing inequality, they'll sometimes point to the theory of diminishing marginal utility of income. That notion that $1 buys less happiness for a billionaire than it does for a battler. Or they might point to the strong relationship between inequality and immobility, with all that wasted potential that it entails. In the words of one recent study, there are more lost Einsteins in unequal countries. A more equal society is one in which we recognise our common obligation to help one another, to lift someone up when they're down on their luck. It's why our soldiers created their own welfare states in the World War II prisoner of war camps. It's how we built social institutions in the first half of the 20th century that were the envy of the world. We might call it generosity, altruism or mateship, but it's no better summed up than with the Maori word aroha. As Cleve Barlow puts it, a person who has aroha for another expresses genuine concern towards them and acts with their welfare in mind, no matter what their state of health or wealth. Aroha is a fundamentally egalitarian idea. Just as society is far more than a collection of individuals, a good life involves far more than the accumulation of wealth for one's own enjoyment. A life lived together is a better life, and a nation that shares its prosperity is richer in every sense. Thank you very much. Now you want me to...
All right, thank you, Andrew. That was really, really interesting. Lots of really interesting data and in some ways quite shocking. But I'll firstly open up the floor and invite questions and discussion and debate and even just clarification on points. So we'll let that. We've got a microphone if anyone would like to raise a question.
Kia ora. Pauline Gulliver from Youth Horizons. Just picking up your point about the IDI and its usefulness in terms of supporting policy development. So just one question there. It tends to be a deficits-focused data set, primarily because that's what we're good at collecting information about. And I wonder if you know of any drivers to maybe, or ways to drive more of a strengths-focused approach to questions that we might raise within integrated data sets like the IDI. Not my understanding, but I think we run the risk of marginalising people even further because we primarily collect information about people who have a lot of involvement with things like social services and incarceration and all those other sorts of things. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so, sorry, I didn't catch your name as you asked. Pauline. In terms of strengths, did you have particular things in mind? Were you thinking of particular cultural capacities, or what were the measures? What would be your ideal measures on strengths?
One example might be, so I helped out with the Family Violence Death Review Committee report last year, and one of the findings in that report, which didn't really get made much of, is that for Māori populations where there was high socioeconomic status, there was virtually no either perpetration or victimisation of family violence, which, and from my point of view anyway, is a really, really important finding. And it's a finding that suggests, like, well, you know, we need to go further. Why is that the case? Are there some strengths within those communities that we need to focus on? Is there more of a cultural tie? You know, what's underlying that? So, whereas what we tend to do is report on the high rates in the low socioeconomic communities, which I think the more we ask that question, the more we drive those sorts of, it's only, I don't want to say this, poor brown people that kill other people, and it's not, you know. And I think that we need to in some ways be reframing some of those questions so that we take more of a strengths-based approach and asking, if this is good in some aspects of society, how can we build on that, and how can we support other people to, you know?
Yes. No, thank you. I think that's really helpful. In terms of how we publicly report, I think there's always a risk of stereotyping and stigmatising groups and causing increased problems because marginalised groups feel that people are just blaming them. One of the interesting uses I've seen recently of big data is work by Carolyn Hoxby in the United States, which looks to identify smart, poor kids who are not getting to university in poor parts of America, and finds huge numbers of these people who are talented enough to win a spot at university, appear to have the package of skills which would attract a full scholarship from a good university, but yet don't seem to be applying. So I guess that's a way in which high quality data identifies the strengths of those particular individuals and ways, and then you're able to think about, well, what do we have to do to help them out? And in a talk I'll give tomorrow, I'll mention a fascinating study done by tax preparer H&R Block, which finds that if you can identify parents of kids who are in year 12 as they come into a tax preparer, and the tax preparer takes 8 minutes in order to help them fill out the financial aid form in the US, you can boost the chances their kid goes to university by about a fifth with an 8-minute intervention. It's amazing. Also, the work by Raj Chetty on Lost Einsteins is looking at the patenting potential of low-income Americans and seeing that there are innovative strengths which are being missed out on. But I also think that to note that multiple sources of disadvantage cross-cut can be stigmatising if used the wrong way, but also can be incredibly valuable in terms of focusing resources. So there's work that Toronto has done with its homeless, where they overlaid usage of health, of hospitals with some of their most chronically sick and homeless people. They had what they called their super users, who were costing the taxpayer about $1 million a year. Now you can stigmatise those people if you like, or else you could just find a smarter way of helping them. Frankly, they could have 2 full-time workers looking after their needs, and the taxpayer would massively benefit, rather than just allowing them to cycle through emergency rooms and spend all these days into hospitals. Only through integrating the data was Toronto able to work out that they were spending vastly more than they needed to for these super users. We've been way too slow in Australia to join up these data sets, and particularly for kids, where we're looking at the overlap of disadvantage, education, parental experience with incarceration. Better understanding the way those things fit together is really important. We should probably be resourcing prisoner re-entry programs far better, for example, to try and ensure that there's not only less recidivism, but also that there's the parenting benefits that can come from mum or dad coming back into the family properly after a spell in jail.
Thank you for a splendid speech, Andrew. Terrific. So many things. I'll just ask about wages. I think you've stressed that good wages or a high labour share are perhaps as important as anything in poverty and reducing poverty. And perhaps you've also suggested that strong unions historically have been as important as perhaps anything in getting good wages. So why don't workers belong to unions anymore? Are they stupid?
Well, unions have always recognised they have a free rider problem. So if I'm in a workplace and someone else will bargain for better wages and they're paying the dues, then it might be in my rational self-interest not to join the union, just to enjoy the wage deals that others get. In the United States, this is dealt with by, in some cases, allowing union-only agreements, so you've got to be part of the union to get the wage deal, or allowing the collection of bargaining fees among the non-members. We don't do that in our countries, so unions face a standard free rider problem. But it's also the case that employers prefer not to have to deal with unions. My Harvard Labour professor, Richard Freeman, said, if you want a simple model in your head for unionisation, think of it as a race between employees to unionise the plant and bosses to set up new plants. So if it's very hard for bosses to set up new plants, such as the public sector or big manufacturing enterprises, you'll see higher unionisation rates. If it's very easy to set up new enterprises, think local cafes or small business, you'll see a lower unionisation rate. So the shift from manufacturing towards services is a non-trivial part of the decline in union membership rates. But then there's just a whole plethora of little laws that tweak the balance. So can a union organiser go and speak to workers during their morning tea break? Can they get their deductions for the union fees out of payroll? What opportunities do they have for bargaining? What are the rules around bargaining? And all of these are sort of deathly dull to people outside the industrial relations system, but collectively they really do make a difference. And I think in both our countries, the pendulum has swung too far towards employers and too far away from unions being able to collectively bargain. And you see this particularly in Australia and the US at the moment, low unemployment, but yet wages sitting pretty stagnant.
Thanks, Andrew. You talked about Australia, New Zealand being the new frontier in the 19th century. Do you have any observations about social media being the new frontier and its impact on inequality?
Wow. John, I was worried when you stood up it was going to be a hard question. So social media, I think, is part of a movement towards balkanising the political conversation. We used to have much more of a conversation in the town squares, and increasingly we're retreating to the cafes on the side and having our own little conversations. And to the extent to which the conversation gets fragmented, I think there's a challenge in people understanding the lived reality of many others in the community. I notice this in the political debate in Australia sometimes, where people simply can't conceive that there could be households in Australia who get by on 5-figure incomes, because all the households they know have a 6-figure income at some level. To tell them that the median Australian household income is $80,000 a year is to give them a statistic they can't wrap their heads around. And the more that they occupy those echo chambers, the more difficult it will be for them to understand the experience of deep disadvantage. You and I were speaking yesterday about the value of bringing public servants to PSN to see directly the work that you do with your clients. And I think the analogue of that is that as we move into getting into narrowcast media, we're much less likely to get a broad sense of our own societies. This is also true in the Antipodes in a way in which it's not in America. America has its poverty concentrated in central cities, which means that for many people it's hard to miss the extent of deep disadvantage because people do pass through the central cities. In Australia and New Zealand, poverty tends to sit around the outskirts of cities, so it is actually possible to live and work in the downtown and not to come across people who are extremely disadvantaged. So it's all the more important for us to think about creative ways of encouraging social mixing. Church used to be a great way of doing this. Churchgoers are far more likely to know a welfare recipient and a CEO. And as church-going rates have declined in our countries, we've lost one of the ways in which people stay in touch with those from in a different class for themselves.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a fascinating talk, and I really appreciated your multifaceted approach. My name is Chanel, and I'm a student at the University of Auckland. And my question is, in your experience, have you noticed over this change that we've observed in New Zealand and Australia, has there been a correlated change in market composition in terms of the share that different industries hold, and how do you think that contributes to inequality?
So Chanel, you've gone to an issue which I find enormously frustrating for lack of data. So I did some work with Adam Triggs, published in the Australian Economic Review in 2016, which looked at market concentration in Australia. In America, this is easy. There's a government agency which collects market composition data. In Australia, you've got to go to a private sector researcher, IBISWorld, and crunch through each of their industry reports in order to look at it. We were able to document that the Australian product market was pretty concentrated. One rule of thumb is if the big 4 firms have more than a third of the market, it's a concentrated industry. On that benchmark, about half of Australian industry, the Australian economy is concentrated. We've got sectors, not just supermarkets and banks, but also beer and baby food, which are extremely concentrated, the big 4 having often 80% of the market. But getting changes over time is the thing that's really eluded us, because the IBISWorld data isn't good for Australia going back historically. So judging market share, we can do it for supermarkets and banks. We can't so easily do it for the cement industry, for example. So we're then left looking at the US, where now quite an important emerging strand of literature has shown that yes, the American economy has become more concentrated. Yes, that appears to have driven inequality. In a world in which you had strong unions, market concentration could have generated rents which were shared between capital and labour. In a world of weak labour unions, market concentration has simply led to more resources going to profits and to corporate executives. So it's true for the US. My sense is it's probably true for our countries, but we need great data on this. If anyone's sort of thinking about important research projects, changing market concentration in New Zealand would be very high on my list.
I've got one, which was yesterday Richard Di Natale, the Greens leader in Australia, talked about having a universal base income. What do you think about that?
It's become the sort of favoured policy of Silicon Valley lately. They don't seem to want to pay very much tax, but they're very keen that there be a big increase in government spending going on universal payments. I'm not sure if they realise quite how big that increase would have to be, however. So if you wanted, for example, people to live above the poverty line on a universal basic income, then we can work that out quite simply, right? Common poverty line is half of average disposable income, which means we need to ensure that everyone gets half of average disposable income, which means for those who work, we need to make sure they're paying significantly more than half of their incomes in tax. So in order to pay this. So we're now looking at tax rates which are not just much higher than we have in Australia and New Zealand, but higher than we get in Scandinavia. Scandinavia has top tax rates which are above 50%, but not average tax rates above 50%. So if you want a universal basic income that's going to bring everyone out of poverty, you're probably looking at tax rates in the order of 60 to 70%, average tax rates in the order of 60 to 70%. The other suggestion has been that this should come through dismantling the social safety net. That worries me deeply as an egalitarian. I think, for example, our National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia has been a really important move, but if you want to fund a universal basic income without significant increases in taxes, then some people say that you ought to be dismantling the other supports, which means somebody who's now getting a lot of support and so they can get assistance at home wouldn't be receiving that. So I don't see anything egalitarian about paying welfare to millionaires. I think it's a knee-jerk response which has emanated out of Silicon Valley and attained a surprising degree of traction in the public debate that it really doesn't deserve.
Hi Andrew. You talked about how New Zealand could learn from Australia around being more progressive with cash benefits. And I feel as though in New Zealand there's this binary between the undeserving and the deserving poor. And do you think something like that is present in Australia, or is it sort of a little bit less intense?
No, it's certainly there. We've had a steady drip feed of stories which have gone from the media offices of Conservative government social services ministers through to the tabloid newspapers, which have talked about the number of welfare claims, for example, and suggested that welfare is in some sense out of control, or that our age pension spending is out of control. But when you look at the actual numbers, we've got extraordinarily well-targeted social safety net. It is far harder to get on the disability support pension than it was 20 years ago. It used to be that the rejection rate was quite low. The rejection rate is now quite high for going on there. So the ability of someone who's suffering from stress or a bad back, for example, to get disability support is much more limited than it once was. Going more broadly, to that question of universal versus targeted, one of the arguments for universalism is that it doesn't introduce welfare stigma. So if you worry that in a society that you have a sort of cultural norms where claiming welfare is seen as demeaning, you might want more universalism. My sense is that welfare stigma in Australia at least, and I think probably New Zealand, is less acute than it is in the United States. I don't see a big gap in the Australian data between the eligible population and the population that actually takes up a particular payment. In the US, there's, for example, in the case of food stamps, quite a big gap between those who are eligible and those who actually take it up. Put the money in the bank account also is less stigmatising than requiring someone to turn up to the cash register with a special card that they swipe.
I was just wondering about your thoughts on, we're looking at a fuel tax here, a regional fuel tax. That's quite significant. And I was wondering about your thoughts on targeted taxes like that for lower income people.
So the standard public finance answer, Catherine, would be that fuel taxes are designed to internalise externalities. They're a Pigouvian tax in the same way as taxes on cigarettes or alcohol would be, and that you're best to redistribute not through those Pigouvian taxes, but through the tax and transfer system. That if you think there is a regressive impact of a fuel tax, you're better to ameliorate it through paying more generous benefits or having some form of an income tax credit. And obviously the huge move internationally has been the move of countries like Indonesia away from heavy fuel subsidies and then using some of that money to look after the most vulnerable. So that'd be my natural inclination as to how to go. We changed the indexation regime around fuel taxes in Australia, which I think was an appropriate thing to do. My party supported that change in the end, and it does reflect the fact that fuel taxes are one way of reducing particularly the negative externality of congestion, which I know is a huge challenge for cities like Auckland or Melbourne or Sydney. An incredible, just deadweight cost on society. You're sitting there in a metal box. It might not be true when we have driverless cars, but right now our populations are spending far too much time commuting, and to the extent that fuel taxes can encourage people to share cars or to use public transport, I think there's a social benefit in that. Thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed the conversation.
So thank you, everybody. And there were lots of really good key outtakes from that. So hopefully we can dwell on those and then look at ways that we can create some integrated action around this issue of improving child wellbeing. Andrew, I really want to acknowledge your huge generosity of spirit in spending your time with us today. The energy and enthusiasm and the humour that came through. I mean, it was a little disconcerting that there were some things that the Aussies are better than us at. But no, it was very engaging, and I've learnt so much in the session today. Really want to acknowledge you. So let's give them another round of applause. And Andrew has been incredibly generous, so he has got a full schedule over the next couple of days. We're heading down to Wellington. We're doing a few sessions there with Treasury boffins and all sorts of other interesting people. So thank you for that too as well. I'd also like to acknowledge KPMG, who have provided the facilities for us today and for the breakfast. So we acknowledge their support. And I'd like to thank all of you. It's fantastic that you've made the time this morning. Really appreciated the discussion and the engagement. We will have these videos up on our website, and we will continue to invite commentary, so questions, things. I'm sure I can send little questions to Andrew to ask after the session, so please feel free to follow that through. And the session that we'll have in Wellington, as I said, Andrew's actually doing different speech, so we'll make that available as well for people, so you can read about that as well. I'd also like to do just a quick special thanks, and it's always hard when there's lots of people, but I do really want to acknowledge you, John, for the idea and the pulling together of the lecture series. I want to thank you, Bronwyn, for all the work that's required to actually get us in the room today. And Susanna, I want to thank you and your team for all the effort that you have done to support that and to create the relationships with our sponsors. So thank you all. Have a great day, and we'll see you at the next of our series in about a month's time. Thank you.